I looked into Putin's eyes, and I saw a stone-cold killer.
When you look in Putin's eyes, what you see is KGB, KGB, KGB.
People working to oppose Putin have made the conscious decision to sacrifice their lives.
If Vladimir Putin could have me killed and have it done in a way that doesn't come back to him, I'd be dead by now.
Working on the National Security Council staff for 4 presidents, I had a pretty good understanding of how the politics worked at a very high level in Washington. There was a period when it looked like there were some real opportunities between the West and Russia. Partly it's because for most of Bush's administration, Putin was still, I think, looking for a way to work with the West. He was the first leader to call President Bush after 9/11 and offer help. I mean, it couldn't have been scripted better in the White House.
I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul.
President Bush met with Putin and famously came back and said that he had looked into Putin's eyes and thought he'd seen his soul. And after my first meeting with Putin, I came back and reported to President Bush, well, I looked into Putin's eyes and I saw a stone-cold killer.
I've traveled the length and breadth of Russia. It's a country I love very much. I'm very fond of Russians, difficult though they often are. I first saw and was aware of Putin in the office of a man called Anatoly Sobchak, who was the mayor of St. Petersburg. Sitting in a desk just beside his was this smallish, slightly weaselly character with fair hair, looking very modest. And it was indeed Vladimir Putin. I certainly didn't speak to him. Why would I? He wasn't of any importance. Let's put it this way, if I had to make a list of the 100 people most likely to be prime minister in Russia, his name wouldn't have been on the list. And I think that was how a lot of people felt. I mean, sheer amazement that Putin would rise so fast and so quickly.
Политический консультант не выбирает, он выслушивает. Моим заказчиком был Кремль. В Кремле Ельцин. И задачей Ельцина было создать идеальную ситуацию ухода. Парадокс тот, что мы занимались проблемой преемника Ельцина, но не знали, кто будет этим преемником. И сам Ельцин тоже не знал. То есть мы решали вопрос, как выиграть выборы для любого человека. Если бы Ельцин привел женщину, моряка, рабочего и сказал вот это, мы сказали, хорошо, будем выбирать вот этого. Он привел Путина.
Back in the late 70s, my parents decided to leave the Soviet Union, and I remember asking my mother why they'd made that decision, and my mother said, you know what, we can either sacrifice our lives to fighting this regime, or we can go have a life elsewhere. And we're not ready to sacrifice our lives. There were many things that happened in the 1990s that were questionably legal, and at one point Yeltsin realized that if the opposition came to power, then he ran a high risk of being prosecuted. And Yeltsin can certainly see himself spending the rest of his days in a Russian jail. And the simplest way to avoid that would be to anoint somebody successor and make sure that that was somebody who would guarantee Yeltsin personally immunity from prosecution. Within days of Putin's being appointed prime minister, a series of terrorist attacks begins.
The midnight explosion collapsed 64 apartments, one on top of the other. The living have been rescued. All that remains is the dead.
Putin positions himself as commander-in-chief, and Yeltsin lets him.
Это вызов уже не государству, это вызов народу. И поэтому ответ должен быть соответствующий. Он должен быть сверхжестким.
And his popularity soars. So this guy goes from having no name recognition to not only being known to every person in the country, but being the most popular politician in the country in the space of 2 months. After the first apartment building explosion, I went into my editor's office. She said, some people are saying this is an FSB job. The FSB is the successor agency to the KGB. We laughed because that's such a crazy idea. And then a couple of weird things happened. One was that a politician speaking in the Russian parliament referred to a catastrophic explosion in Volgodonsk. The only thing is that that announcement preceded the actual bomb by 3 days. So in 6 months, I went from laughing at the idea that this could have been an FSB job to thinking that that was the most likely explanation, that this was somebody's plan for taking Putin from no name recognition to being the most popular politician in the country.
Knowing the magnitude of Putin's ruthlessness, it would not surprise me in the least if the Russian intelligence services were behind that bombing.
In London today, authorities revealed that former KGB spy Alexander Litvinenko, who died yesterday, was killed by a rare and deadly radioactive poison.
Sacha used to work for the FSB against organized crime, but then Sacha realized something wrong, particularly in corruption, what started to be very big in FSB. He openly said FSB became a very dangerous organization.
He was in charge of the internal investigation unit looking into corruption within the Russian intelligence service. He found a lot. He made a great deal of enemies.
I have concluded that the FSB operation to kill Mr. Litvinenko was probably approved by Mr. Patrushev, then head of the FSB, and also by President Putin.
Everything started at midnight. He started to feel very, very sick. He was not able to talk because all his throat was just so painful and white, because all his tissue inside was damaged. And then I just tried to calm him down, saying, Sacha, it would be fine. And I realized all his hair and my gloves. It was the last 2 days of Sacha's life. For 23 days, it was a torture from very beginning till the end. And when they decided to collect samples of urine, they realized it was polonium. Everybody was shocking. It was the first time ever investigate case of killing person by radioactive material.
Litvinenko left behind a deathbed statement, leaving no doubt who he thought had killed him.
You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life.
It's very important for people to understand how he loved life. He was full of life. He tried to help people. But Sacha was a normal person and never expecting maybe to be a hero. I want all world will understand Russia, it is not Putin, and Putin is not Russia.
If I were to try to remember off the top of my head people who have died under mysterious circumstances, whom Putin would have had reason to want to see dead, we might start with Anatoly Sobchak, died of a mysterious heart attack. Sergei Yushchenko, member of parliament, shot dead in front of his apartment. Yuri Shikachikhin, investigative journalist and member of parliament, died of a strange allergic reaction. Stas Markelov, who was a human rights lawyer, and Anastasia Baburova, who happened to be walking alongside him. Natalia Istimirova, Chechen human rights activist, abducted and found dead. Anna Politkovskaya, investigative journalist, survived one assassination attempt by poisoning, was shot dead in her apartment building. There have been times when I've had, I think my record was 400 death threats in a week. So I'd be stupid if I never thought about risks to my life.
A country where some of the leading dissident figures are killed is a country where somebody's got a short fuse. Most people think that Putin is a kind of mujik figure. Mujik is a kind of village, tough guy, not one of these smoothies that would go off to Paris or London, but a real proper Russian. That's what Russian people, by and large, want their leader to be. They want people that don't do any apologizing. They want a tough guy who's perfectly prepared to punch you in the face when he meets you.
When Russia went from communism to capitalism, from a business person's perspective, the sky was the limit and fortunes could be made instantaneously. And I saw this as a big opportunity. I set up this investment fund to invest in these companies. One of the things that we did to try to understand the situation was do a stealing analysis of Gazprom. We were able to determine that the management of Gazprom between 1996 and 1999 had stolen oil and gas reserves equal to the size of Kuwait. Once I shared this information, it created a whole political firestorm inside of Russia. Everything was going great as an investor until October of 2003, when Putin arrested the richest man in Russia, put him on trial, and allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. And one by one, the oligarchs went back to Russia, and they sat down with Putin and said, "Vladimir, what do we have to do to not sit in the cage?" And from that moment on, the oligarchs were no longer Putin's enemies, they were his business partners. And from that moment on, my alignment of interests with Putin ended, and he turned against me.
Putin has, I think, a very Manichaean view of the people that he deals with. Basically, you're for me or you're against me. So you have some oligarchs that have spent a lot of time in Siberia, others who have had to flee to the West, a couple who have been killed. On the other hand, the oligarchs that have done what Putin said, they're 15 years or so ago, have remained billionaires and remain influential and powerful and very rich. So, I mean, Putin has kept his word to them. I think Putin's attitude toward most of the people around him is, "What have you done for me lately?"
November 13th, 2005, I was flying back to Russia, and I was stopped at Sheremetyevo 2 in the VIP lounge, roughly taken down to the detention center of the airport. I was locked up for 15 hours, deported back to London, and subsequently declared a threat to national security. My offices were raided. They seized all of our corporate documents, and then those documents were used to perpetrate a massive $230 million tax rebate fraud, basically stealing the taxes that we had paid from the Russian government. So we went out and hired the smartest lawyer we could find, a young Russian man named Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei exposed that crime, and roughly a month after he testified against them, the same officials we exposed came to his home, arrested him, put him into pretrial detention, where he was then tortured to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in an isolation cell, they chained him to bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died.
I want to recognize Sergei Magnitsky, whose remarkable life and tragic death is the reason, the catalyst that brought us here today.
Putin and his cronies steal money in Russia, they travel to the West. They keep their money in the West. They send their kids to school in the West. So I came up with an idea, which is to take away their ability to travel to the West and to spend their money in the West. And this became known as the Magnitsky Act in America. Putin said this was the single largest foreign policy priority to stop the Magnitsky Act, hit the Achilles heel of the Putin regime.
We are sending a signal to Vladimir Putin and to the Russian kleptocracy that these kinds of abuses of human rights will not be tolerated.
In retaliation, Putin held a trial in 2013 in which he put Sergei Magnitsky, who his officials had killed in prison, put him on trial, dead. They put me on trial in absentia as his co-defendant. There were 2 empty seats in a cage in a major Russian courtroom. There was a judge, there was prosecution lawyers, there was appointed defense lawyers, there was bailiffs, there was court reporters, there was a gallery, there was journalists, and they found us both guilty. This was the first time in the history of Russia they'd ever put a dead man on trial. They couldn't do anything more to Sergei after they found him guilty, but they sentenced me to 9 years in absentia in a Russian prison. If Vladimir Putin could have me killed and have it done in a way that doesn't come back to him, I'd be dead by now.
Putin was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB posted in Dresden in East Germany. At least once, I pointed out to him that when I was deputy director of CIA and meeting with his bosses that he'd been a lieutenant colonel in Dresden. Facing Putin is different than what one might think. In all my meetings with him, he never once raised his voice. He can be very sarcastic. He's very matter-of-fact. So he's a very serious person. He doesn't have what I would call a sense of humor.
When you're head of the CIA and head of intelligence, you get some insight into what someone who's been involved with intelligence is all about. You have a pretty good sense about how Putin operated because they did exactly the same thing. Engaged in intelligence operations, engaged in spying, engaged in trying to undermine our country in whatever way they could. He's operating on the basis that he can do whatever the hell he wants. And when somebody feels they can do that, they're dangerous. When you look in Putin's eyes, what you see is KGB, KGB, KGB.
Vladimir Putin was the head of the secret police. And the secret police is an organization that kills, that poisons, that assassinates. And so I have no doubt that all the high-profile assassinations that have been done in Russia have been done with Putin's blessing, for sure, and perhaps his instruction.
The Russian state, for hundreds of years, really, has used poison as a weapon against its enemies.
Я не ставлю мету зробити політику проти Росії. Я ставлю мету зробити політику, яка консолідує українську націю. Ключовий мотив, чому мені було запропоновано зустрітися із керівником Служби безпеки, чесно кажучи, в той день я абсолютно не хотів йти на цю зустріч. Це вже була там 10-11 година вечора. І вже Можна було б завершувати цю всю розмову. Приносять на переносному столі ще гарячі і просять ще, давайте гаряче з'їмо. Ну, мабуть, один продукт, який порційно роздавався. І от, власне кажучи, після того, як я покуштував цей плов, в мене почала боліти голова, причому дуже прогресивно. 2-3 хвилини проходить, в мене біль стає невиносимою. Потім обличчя почало розпухати, я став удвічі більший в обличчі, чим ви мене бачите зараз. Моє тіло носило там практично синьо-рожевий колір. Всі люди, які були причетні до подачі порційних продуктів, на другий день покинули Україну і поїхали в Москву. І до сьогоднішнього дня слідство не мало змоги допитати тих людей. Коли слідство поглиблювалося і виходили вже на характеристики формул діоксину, слідство звернулося в 4 лабораторії світу, які виробляють цей клас діоксину. Єдина лабораторія, яка до сьогоднішнього дня не дала відповідь, це російська. Я персонально звертався до президента Путіна, щоб усі ті проблеми, які виникають у цього слідства і які залежать від російської сторони, були розв'язані. Я до сьогоднішнього дня не отримав відповіді.
Wir haben unsere Untersuchungen in den letzten 24 Stunden größtenteils abgeschlossen, dass bei Herrn Dr. Yushchenko eine Vergiftung mit Dioxin vorliegt.
Putin was at the Munich Security Conference in February of 2007. I was on the aisle on one side on the front row, and Putin was on the aisle in the front row on the other side. Next to him was Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, and next to her was President Yushchenko of Ukraine, who believed, I think with some good reason, that the KGB had tried to poison him. And so his face was all pockmarked from the results of this attempt. So when Merkel gets up to welcome everybody to give the keynote, for all practical purposes, Putin and Yushchenko are sitting next to each other. And the look that Yushchenko gave Putin was one of unmitigated hatred. I mean, it was amazing.
Хочу підкреслити, та політика, яку сьогодні проводить Росія, це політика, автором якої є Путін. У всіх її проявах.
Если ты человек-плакат, человек-лозунг, любите подчиняться плоско. Если ты человек-плакат, человек-лозунг.
At this point, people who are working to oppose Putin at home are people who have made the conscious decision to sacrifice their lives to fighting this regime. They're absolute and total heroes. And I would certainly include the women of Pussy Riot in that number. They were the first people jailed by Putin for peaceful protest, which at this point is impossible to imagine. That was just 4 years ago. Now it's like old hat.
It was a mixture between hard rock music gig and prayer vigil to the Virgin Mary, who they implored to remove Vladimir Putin from office. Several days later, alleged participants in this punk prayer protest were detained. The young women now face 7 years in jail for hooliganism.
They didn't mention actually on Russian TV news that we came to the church to protest against Putin. They told the Russian people that we came to church to destroy religion, which wasn't the case at all.
I'd like to talk about the trial and jailing of Pussy Riot.
Could you please translate the name of the band into Russian?
Pussy Riot, the punk band. I don't know what you call them in Russian, sir. Maybe you could tell me.
The attacks had a devastating effect on all our traditional religions. And so in general, I think the state has to protect the feelings of believers. I will not comment on whether the verdict is well-grounded and the sentence proportionate to the offense.
В этой стране все такого рода решения принимает только один человек, Путин, больше никто. Поэтому, конечно, будет принимать решение сам лично Владимир Путин.
I was in correspondence with them actively and visited one of them while they were in jail. This is the Gulag as it was when Solzhenitsyn wrote about it. I saw what a nightmare it was. It is slave labor, it is sleep deprivation, it is starvation, it is torture, it is just physical and emotional humiliation 24/7. It is very difficult to remain unbroken. They did, they remained unbroken, although I saw how close Nadya came to being broken.
Russian female prisons is much more severe than male prisons. We have just one source of power in female prison, and it comes from prison boss. We call him master, and he's really master of your life. We had to work for 16 hours per day. They don't allow you to go to toilet, to go to have a snack, or to go to smoke. We have a problem with medicine, we have problems with food, we have problem with unofficial punishments. It was officially prohibited for people to talk with me because I could spread my political viruses. But anyway, some of them passed me notes, some of them secretly spoke with me. I was like, I have to do something with that. So I started a hunger strike. I wrote an open letter. It was published in the main independent Russian media source. Because I started hunger strike, I had official right to be isolated. So when I'm isolated, just me would face all troubles and not people around me. Because of hunger strike, I started to have blisters on my skin, all around my body and behind my hairs, like between my hairs, and like, it was painful. And it was kind of scary because I never know, like, will I have scars after that? And obviously, all prison bosses and doctors are running around me like, you will die tomorrow. You have to finish your hunger strike.
They have done something courageous. I think they have paid the price for this act, and I pray for their freedom. And I know that everyone in this auditorium, if you're here as my fan, feels they deserve the right to be free.
We expected to be in prison like around 3 years. So when we got 2 years, it wasn't so bad, relatively. And probably we had this 2 years because of all this media attention. Like, a lot of people were helping us, and we are really thankful to them. Ultimate boss is Vladimir Putin. I'm sure that he knows about a situation which is going on in Russian prisons, and moreover, it's super comfortable for him because people should be afraid. It's formula which work for every dictator and for Putin too.
Putin is a person who values two things in his life, money and power. people's lives are not a value for him.
Мы абсолютно не согласны ни с планом Путина, ни с его курсом.
My father was the leader of the opposition, and he believed that his mission was to fight with Putin, not with those people who actually worked with Putin, but directly with Putin. Facing is confronting, and my father faced Putin because he wanted our country to be based not on the word of Putin. His favorite words were Russia without Putin.
Мы должны сказать, хватит маразму. Мы должны сказать, Россия и Украина без Путина. Россия и Украина без Путина.
My father experienced increasing pressure. He was kept in custody 2 times for taking part in protests, and this protest was approved by the city council. They launched lots of slandering campaigns against my father.
Мне кажется, что те, кто говорят о какой-то диктатуре, сами о ней мечтают. И в современной России эта их мечта уже недостижима. Поезд ушел.
He was attacked in the streets by some pro-Kremlin youth movements. His cell phone was overheard, and once his private conversations were published. My father was depicted as a national traitor. It was a big stress for him because he thought of himself, and it was very true, that he was a very pro-Russian politician. He wanted the best for Russia, and he fought for better Russia, and he sacrificed lots of things for this, and finally his life.
There is more breaking news tonight. One of Vladimir Putin's top opponents, who just last week was quoted in Russian media saying, quote, "I'm scared that Putin will kill me," has been gunned down in Moscow, shot in the back.
It was a big shock, I think, for all people. No one could have imagined, honestly, that might have happened to my father.
The only way that anyone could have conducted an assassination in front of the Kremlin against the most beloved Russian opposition politician would be with the formal blessing and instructions from Vladimir Putin.
Putin may be a very tough and possibly nasty character, but of all the stupid places to have Nemtsov shot, under the walls of the Kremlin is you know, going to be right up there with them.
Но с момента убийства Немцова у нас ситуация изменилась. И изменилось, конечно, отношение к Путину тоже. Крайне маловероятно, чтобы он сам отдал этот приказ. Но он устроил систему так, что это теперь может происходить и без него. Немцова убили прямо, можно сказать, под окнами Путина. Очень сильный удар по авторитету Путина и по его способности контролировать. То, что Путин был потрясен, для меня ясно из того, что он просто исчез на несколько дней, он не появлялся. Как-то увидел, что он не контролирует свой задний двор.
Someone told me recently that I'd photographed more world leaders than anyone in history. I don't know if that's true, but I'm very familiar with power, and I'm fascinated by it. Nothing is like Putin. Nothing. It's different. It's not trying too hard. It just is. And it has this quiet, calm chill that leaves you really humble. I got the call about 4 weeks before the shoot was to happen, and it was for Time magazine, and they were preparing Person of the Year. They flew me to Moscow. I wasn't sure when it's going to be, so I was put in this hotel and just told to wait. And it went on and on and on forever, and it got more and more painful. And then one day I got the call, tomorrow morning you'll be picked up by a black Kremlin BMW. We drove through the streets of Moscow, approaching this imposing building of the Kremlin. And then we went past the Kremlin into a dark, bleak, Gothic forest. And I thought I was going to get whacked. I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one knows where I am. It felt like intimidation. Eventually, we arrived at probably the most imposing building I've ever seen in my life. And it's not that it was big, it was just mean. You're confronted by a 1.5 or 2-story security wall on the outside that's covered in snipers. And I looked up and I see like all the snipers turn to me. It was like snow up to here, and I'm just in a suit. And at gunpoint, out in the trunk of the car, I had to open all my equipment. And I remember this guy was using the barrel of his gun to point to every lens, and he said, open, open, open. And I mean, I didn't have a coat. I was shivering, my nose was dribbling. I'm not James Bond, man. I'm not cool. And this was so intimidating. And then at gunpoint, I'm led into the building. I was led into a small room and kept in this room for about 7-8 hours. And then suddenly there's a knock at the door and they said, you can go into his office to set up. So I grabbed all my equipment and they said, you've got 15 minutes. And at one point in my mad scramble, I realized I needed power for my strobe light. I was watched by a gang of bodyguards and I saw one power socket, but there was already a plug in it. It was near his desk. So I went to pull that one out to put mine in. I remember them screaming, "Niet! Niet!" And then one of them pointed to the wire and he followed the wire, which went onto his desk into the back of a red phone in a glass case with a single button on it. So, I mean, that just added to the insanity of the whole situation. It felt like I'm going rogue in Putin's office. The swing doors open. Putin enters the room. He's flanked by, I think it was 2 translators who constantly whisper in his ear. He had a group of probably political advisors, and then he had a whole gang of tough guys, heavies. You know, it's kind of, they had shaved heads, one had a scar, it was that kind of thing. They all come up to me and I said, Mr. President, you know, I nervously said, you know, it's such an honor to be in Russia. And I have a question to ask you, if I may, that's got nothing to do with politics. So the translators whispered in his ear and they all turn around and look at me and they say, what is the question? We have to be quick. So I said, well, I'm a massive Beatles fan. Are you? So they translated the question, and then he looked at the translators and his advisors, and I guess in Russian, he just ordered them all out of the room immediately. It was very abrupt, and it was almost as if, get out. So it was me, Putin, and a gang of heavies. And again, I didn't know what's about to happen now. You know, have I done something terrible? Should I not have been human? Should I not have been an ordinary citizen and just asked what the question that I was quite interested in asking? Then he looks at me and in pretty much perfect English, he says, I love the Beatles. So I said, I didn't know you spoke English. And he kind of nods very quietly. He doesn't say a lot, you know, he's very quiet. But there's sort of this crystally charisma in his eyes. And he says, what do you want? Let's do it. I remember as I'm focusing my camera, trying to stop my hand shaking, I ended up 1.5 inches away from his nose. I could feel his breath on my hand as I focused the camera. Now, from that view, when I looked into his eyes, I just saw power. And it was cold, it was calm, it was power that I've never felt before. And to me, it felt like Russia first, at all costs.
Putin technically can remain president of Russia until 2024. I think he will bend every effort to remain president of Russia for the rest of his life. He will somehow change the constitution that allows him to continue to be re-elected, very much like elections took place in the Soviet Union, where the outcome was a foregone conclusion.
He came to rule a great country at a very painful moment in its development. It had not recovered from totalitarianism, it had not recovered from communist rule, it had not reckoned with its memory. He destroyed the culture by returning it to a totalitarian state. And I don't know whether Russia will ever recover from this period.
He moves quickly. He sees an opening. He decides to move into that opening. He believes that by asserting power, that he can control ultimately what happens, but he isn't thinking about where this is all headed. I think he's engaged in a mission that is not going to have a good outcome.
Я все-таки историк, и для меня история Путина – это часть русской истории. И русская история состоит из множества поражений. Почти никого нельзя назвать, кто бы не потерпел поражение. Победителей у нас почти нет. Поэтому я понимаю Путина. Это такая печальная русская история.
Putin has created this myth of himself that if he's not in power, if he's not the strong man, then the whole country will disintegrate. The Russian people deserve better than that, and Russia deserves better than that.
Getting rid of Putin will be just the beginning for Russia.
He became president because he was able to promise Boris Yeltsin that he would protect the Yeltsin family and all the money the Yeltsin family stole. And he's kept his word. There is nobody in Russia today who can make that promise realistically to Vladimir Putin. My personal belief is he will leave that office feet first. Over time, Putin convinced himself that he was not just a Russian president, but that he had been chosen, that this was a God-given mission that he had to restore Russia to greatness.